But what we're seeing in the last number of years is some of the smartest entrepreneurs and investors and even private equity groups that are becoming franchisees because it's just such an accelerant to wealth creation.
Welcome to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast, where we talk about all things franchising. Now, here's your host, Dr. John P. Hayes.
Hi, it's John Hayes with another episode of the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast. And my guest today, Dan Monaghan, who has a long history in franchising, and that's what we're going to talk about today, along with Dan's appearance at the Selling Franchises Bootcamp, where he will be one of our keynoters. More about that in a moment. Dan, welcome. I appreciate you taking time to meet with me and speak to my audience and help us get educated more about franchising.
Great to be here, John.
So, Dan, you got your start very early in franchising. I think somewhere around 5 or 6, and I relate to that. You were dreaming about a Dairy Queen franchise. And, you know, I'm a product of the 1950s. My family we got to go to Dairy Queen once a week, including the dog. Dairy Queen in those days actually had a tiny tot cone that was free that the dog could have. And we got a cone, I think maybe a nickel or a dime. My father always got a milkshake for 25 cents. I always wanted those milkshakes. And he said, get yourself a job and a quarter and you can have a milkshake. So Dairy Queen was my favorite right from the very beginning. Fortunately, I didn't own one because I would have eaten all the profits. But I understand the desire for Dairy Queen. But at 19, you actually got in to an ice cream franchise in Canada called Dickie D ice cream bicycle business. And then you used the profits to pay your way through the university, which, wow, there's no better testimonial to franchising than that kind of a story. But since then, you've continued to excel in franchising, co-founding WSI, a digital marketing / consulting franchise business in Canada. And then you founded Clear Summit Group, private equity firm investing in emerging brands, including College Pro, Recruiting in Motion, and others. I think I read that you have more than 1,500 franchise locations worldwide. CSG is known as a franchise accelerator. I want to talk about that term, what that is and why. And then you're involved with the International Franchise Association. You serve on the board of governors for the CFE program. You're vice chair of the IFA Foundation, also author of a couple of books at least. And I want to talk about franchising for people who don't know what it is, don't know why they should be in franchising, and get your view on that. I always say as an educator, there's no better model for building wealth today, any place in the world that I can think of. And I've been all over the world talking about franchising. I can't think of a better model. I haven't seen a better model than franchising for giving you independence, giving you your own business, and giving you that opportunity to build wealth. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd agree with that. And, you know, there's so much buzz these days and over the last number of years just around startups and everybody, you know, starting a business on the side and you know, everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. They want to own their own business. And there's great reasons for that, right? You know, the freedom, the flexibility, the wealth creation and all that. But personally, I think some of that is really overblown. It's overplayed. You know, there's so much glamour around the startup world. But when you really look at success rates, especially with, you know, in the tech field or whatever, I mean, I don't know if it's 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, but the success rates of a real startup that scales and grows and creates, you know, 7 figures and beyond are minuscule. And so I think franchising is one of the best kept secrets in the entrepreneurial world and in the business world because it's like a startup with a blueprint. It's like you actually are building your business on the shoulders of other giants who have already been successful before you. And I think in some ways, you know, sometimes people think, well, if you can't start your own business, then you buy a franchise. But what we're seeing in the last number of years is some of the smartest entrepreneurs and investors and even private equity groups that are becoming franchisees because it's just such an accelerant to to wealth creation. So I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying in terms of the power of franchising.
Yeah. And yet, when you say franchising is the best kept secret, I've always felt that way. I've been at this since 1979 when I wrote Franchising: The Inside Story. And that really got me into franchising. I got hooked on franchising. I did not intend to be a franchisee. Didn't really know what that was at the time until I wrote the book. But all through my career, very few universities would teach anything about franchising. In fact, business schools kind of poo-pooed franchising as a copycat, not real business. It was following somebody else's success. Now, in more recent years, with the launching of the Titus Center just 5 years ago, where we offer a concentration in franchising, and we've got more than 60 students at the undergraduate level involved in that program. And Louisville has, because of Yum, they've got a global center for franchising. Babson has a center for franchising. University of Tennessee has started a center for franchising, one coming up in Denver as well. So suddenly we're seeing this emerging desire for franchisors to underwrite franchise centers and programs at universities. And we're seeing young people come to college to study something, could be politics, could be pharmacy, could be business marketing, and discovering, oh, there's this thing called franchising. And generally, the 60 some that I have, those students will tell you, when I came to college, I had no plan to study franchising. I didn't even know what it was. And then either through a friend, a roommate, or maybe hearing me as a speaker, they discover franchising and they want to get involved and they see the power of that opportunity. So it's really flattering and fun and exhilarating at this stage of my career to be involved in doing that. But I'm wondering, you started at 19. Why would that be a bad idea to start at 19 in franchising?
Well, it's kind of the inverse, I have to say, because there are so many assumptions that people often make, when you come in with a blank slate as a kid, and all is what you're learning and what you're being trained by the franchisor. You're not bringing any baggage along with you other than maybe some of your upbringing. I mean, my dad was a janitor and my mom was a part-time nurse. So I didn't really have a real business acumen or a sense of, wealth creation or that kind of thing. But I mean, I was teachable and I was willing to learn. And so I think that's one of the advantages of starting young. And if you're starting at an older age and you've come through the corporate world with all kinds of experience, you might have to be willing to leave some of that at the door of the training room as you're coming into that franchisor, because you're learning their blueprint and you bring your own personality to it and your own experience, but following the system is critical to success. Yeah. So I would say, the business I was part of, it was designed for students, entrepreneurs, similar to the College Pro business that we recently acquired. And so it wasn't really capital intensive, but I have to say, my first weekend, I still remember it. It was April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And it was the hottest, it was 30, I'm talking Celsius here in Canada, but it was 35, 34 degrees. So we're talking about close to 100 degrees, mid 90s.
Yeah.
At the end of that first long weekend, I had $3,000 cash in my hands. I'd never seen $1,000 cash in my life, like in one place, like cash. And I'm holding $3,000 cash. Yeah. And that was where the lights went on for me. This franchising thing is incredible because all I did was follow their system and it worked.
Well, how did you know you could follow a system or that you would follow a system?
Somebody said to me once that, it's important when you're getting involved in a business to put yourself somewhere in a position between serious and nervous. Not so nervous that you can't sleep at night, but serious enough that you can't afford to not make it work. You think about that. I think was it Marcus Aurelius, where they burned the boats when they came across the channel there and there was no turning back. And so I had to put myself through university. It's like my parents didn't have the money. And so if I didn't make it this summer, like my buddies were getting jobs, but if I didn't make it, much or worse, I lost money, I couldn't continue. So I was in that situation where I couldn't afford to fail. And I think sometimes that's not a bad position to be in. There's this concept of getting leverage on our fear. So sometimes fear holds people back, but fear can also drive us. If we think about what happens if we fail and we realize we can't afford that to happen, that can fuel us on. And I think that for me was some of the fuel in those early years.
And again, because of the franchise model, it's designed in a way, if you select a good one, and they're not all good, whether there are 4,000 franchise brands in North America or 5,000 brands, I don't think anybody knows for sure, but there are thousands to select from, and they're not all equal. Some are better than others. So you've got to do some due diligence to make sure you're selecting one that you can excel at and that they've got a system that actually does work. If you can get beyond that, then it is a model that will help you succeed.
Yeah. And, there's so many things to look at when you're choosing a franchise, to all the points that you raised in terms of the success track record of the model, speaking to franchisees, et cetera, but also the culture of the company, the values. Every company has a different kind of culture. And it's not just you're joining a company, you're joining a family in many ways. You're committing to what is oftentimes a 10-year agreement. So it's like you're going to hang out with this group of people within this company, within this culture for the next 10 years of your life. So that's really important, finding a fit with the people. And then, sometimes people get really caught up in the sizzle of what the industry the company's in, but you want to get clarity on what is the role of the owner. Like if I buy into this franchise, what am I doing every day? And is that something I'm going to love to do? Or is it something that I'm going to wake up dreading at some point in time? And so speaking to other franchisees, you'll learn, like, what does a day in the life of a franchisee look like? And can I see myself doing this for the next 10 years?
And that's another point, that where else can you go to find a model that allows you all the time you want to do due diligence? And part of that due diligence is if they've got 100 franchisees, and most don't, if they've got 60 or 70 franchisees, you could call all 60 or 70 if you want. Don't think you have to, but you could call 6 or 7 for sure and find out, is this a good fit for me? And yet in your experience as a franchisor, how many people don't do that? They just don't do the due diligence, which is as simple as sending an email to an existing franchisee and asking some questions, or getting on the phone, or visiting a franchisee. How many don't do that?
Yeah, definitely many don't do enough of it. And I think a well-informed franchisee makes oftentimes a much better franchisee because they're coming in with their eyes open. They've kind of calibrated their expectations so that there's no disconnect between what they were expecting and what they actually get, because they're speaking to real franchisees, and the more of them, the better. I often, when I'm speaking to franchisees through our onboarding process, I'll often, ask them about that, that validation process as they spoke to other franchisees. And I'll say, like, what did you learn about what it takes to be successful in this business? And I want to hear that they've really heard about and they've learned about the tough elements of what it takes to be successful. If they just heard all kinds of good things, and everybody they talked to was like over the moon, happy with what they heard, I want to hear them. I'm going to ask them, like, who did you best identify with? Who did you feel that you're most like? Who's most like you? Who's least like you? I want to try to get a profile for them as to, whether they're similar to our high performing franchisees. Quite often it's the best process for us, for those who go through it and say, this isn't for me, because, we're entering a 10-year, agreement here, and we want to make sure that we are best suited for each other. One of the things I find corporate people often don't get about franchising is, when they're founders of a franchise system, or or, they're brought in as a hired gun to lead a franchise system, I'll often try to explain to them to say, you can fire a customer out there in the business world. You can fire an employee, but you can't fire a franchisee. If you brought somebody into this system and it's not a good fit, that's a problem, because it's much more like a marriage, and it's not something that can be easily ended, like firing a franchisee or firing an employee or firing a customer. So that whole process of validation and speaking to other franchisees is really important to find that not just a fit in terms of the business and the role, but the cultural fit. Are we aligned in terms of our values?
Why is it that people don't take that seriously and don't do it? And franchisors don't all require it because they're maybe too eager to sell a franchise. Good franchisors, or the best franchisors, want to make sure that the procedures have been followed even before becoming a franchisee, because it's an indicator. If you don't do the due diligence, and we're telling you to do that, recommending that you do that, IFA recommends that you do that, you don't do that, then what's the chance you're going to follow our system when we tell you what to do from A to Z?
Well, it's a great point, and it's one of the opportunities I think some franchisors miss is that you have a defined, selection process, and the extent to which someone follows that and complies with that is a good proxy for the extent to which they will make a good franchisee. And, I've talked to franchise founders and CEOs in the past that, complain about a difficulty they've had with a franchisee. And I'll say, so where were the red flags, in that selection process? Can you tell me about something that happened? And there's usually a handful of red flags, minor things sometimes, but in hindsight, the franchisor realizes that they could have picked up on something really important based on how someone went through that selection process, the extent to which they didn't do the due diligence effectively, the extent to which they didn't prepare for the next interviews in the selection process. And they thought about it like buying a car. And it's not like that. It's we call it a mutual evaluation process. Mm-hmm. They're looking at us, we're looking at them, but we both need to be doing a lot of work in that process. And some people just want to come sailing through it like they would if they were buying, a T-bill, or if they're buying a real estate property, or if they're buying a car. And those, I don't make the best franchisees.
Before we continue, let me tell you about the Selling Franchises Bootcamp coming up at Palm Beach Atlantic University, the home of the Titus Center for Franchising in West Palm Beach. This 2-day boot camp is jam-packed with information and people who will help you sell more franchises in 2023 and beyond. Everything from lead generation to technology that people are using today to sell more franchises, to events that you can incorporate, to how to sell to the generations of people who are buying franchises. Baby boomers don't buy the same way as Gen Z buys, and you need to know that information. Plenty of networking opportunities, 3 major keynotes, lots of information that will be valuable to you in this 2-day boot camp at Palm Beach Atlantic University. You can get all the details at tituscenter.com. Click on Selling Franchises Bootcamp. It's set for January 19 and 20, 2023. Yeah, and I think that in that explanation that you just gave, there's a big percentage of people who don't succeed as franchisees. Can you take it back to that in your experiences at WSI and other franchises? If you go back and look at the people, if you have 100 franchisees and the bottom 25 just aren't cutting it, they complain all the time, they don't validate, they're the ones that would say, no, these guys are crooks, don't buy into this, it was a mistake. Are those the people that didn't do the due diligence up front? Or are those the people that the franchisor didn't do enough due diligence on them?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. And it's a blend of art and science. And as much as, I've been doing this now for 27, 28 years, and And I haven't figured out the exact formula to be able to profile a high-performing franchisee. We do a better job of it every year than the year before. We've used AI tools. We've used psychometric profiling. We use, what we call a nominations committee, where we actually get feedback from franchisees in that selection process. Like, is this someone that's worthy of joining our system? Do you give us your view of them? So they're actually being interviewed by our franchisees as well. And so it is complex, all the different elements of. Greg Nathan, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has done extensive research in this in terms of correlations with success, and looked at all kinds of different things, like who makes a good franchisee. Is it an entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur, a male, a female, a teacher, a corporate person? And there's lots of interesting research around that we've absorbed as well. But, another factor is, we do behavioral interviewing. So one of the things we often find, and psychologists refer to this as locus of control. So some people have an internal locus of control and other people have an external. So when bad things happen in our life, do we tend to look in the mirror and take ownership of that? Or do we tend to blame others, blame the market, blame the franchisor, blame the employer, blame their wife, the family, etc.? And so there's questions that we'll ask people in our selection process around, tell me about a time in your life where things didn't go as you planned. Tell me about a situation that happened at your work where you didn't feel you were treated fairly. And so you open up this open-ended question, and they go there and they start to tell the story. And based on how they tell that story, you begin to develop a perspective of their locus of control. Is this a person who's a blamer, who doesn't take ownership and accountability for their situation? And so that's another, again, we're talking highly qualitative, and as I said, more art than science, but there's a lot of techniques you can use to try to filter those people that are going to be your high performers from not. Yeah. And also keeping in mind that some people are too entrepreneurial to make good franchisees.
Exactly.
I mean, they'll reinvent the wheel for reinvention's sake. They're mavericks. And so you can learn about that in the selection process as well, based on the kinds of questions that you ask them.
In the profiling that you have done, or profiles that you've used, I'm curious, have you used the DISC profile?
Yes. We've used DISC, we've used Myers-Briggs, we use Caliper, which is what we found to be most effective, but very familiar with DISC, yes.
Yeah, I love DISC. For one thing, the cost of DISC is anybody can afford to use DISC. And it won't give you everything that Caliper, others are going to give you. But I've always found, and at HomeVestors, where I was the CEO of We Buy Ugly Houses, we relied on the DISC profile. We knew if you weren't a D personality, you would not be buying 40, 50, 100 houses a year. You can't do it without that D quality.
Right.
You could still become a franchisee, but you have to bring a D into the business with you in order to be a big home run franchisee in that case. So I love the DISC profile. I use it with all of my students to find out very early what their personality is, because otherwise you can't communicate. You can't teach an S personality the same way you teach a D, or the same way you teach an I or a C. So, and it's not difficult. And franchisors, I think, poo-poo that kind of information far too often. What do you think?
Totally agree. And so DISC is, as you said, a personality profiling tool. We use DISC at WSI, extensively for, probably over 25 years, 23 years maybe. Yeah. And the other thing that people miss about the power of the DISC system and other tools as well is that it's not just a tool for you to get to know them, but it's also a tool for how you can use them. You can use the tool to coach them. Yeah. So when we onboard someone, we hand that file onto the training department. We hand that on to the coaching department so that they have a real tool to help them better communicate. You're going to, as you know, you're going to communicate differently with a D than you are going to be with an S. Yeah. And sometimes some of the tension and conflict happens because you've got a D talking to an S or vice versa. And so we try to align our coaching team. Some people work better with Ds and others have a difficulty in working with these.
Yeah.
The one thing where we find a limitation with traditional personality profiles is it's not necessarily a measure of capability or competency.
Right.
It's a measure of how we communicate, what our personality is, what situations we feel comfortable in. Yeah. And so the caliper gives us for some of our brands, there's some really important capabilities and competencies that we need that it helps us pick up on.
Yeah. And why franchisors don't get that, I don't understand in more than 40 years of working with people. As a teacher, and a franchisor is partly a teacher. You've got to train and support franchisees. If you don't know the model that they require, whether they're an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner, or the words that register with them and words that do not register with them, or the way you treat them, whether you pat them on the back or you don't touch them, depending on their personality. Why franchisors don't get that, I don't know. And I think IFA as well can do more to help bring home that message. And in fact, in last spring at the International Franchise Expo, New York City, CFE training, like a day or two before, I did teach the DISC program, How to Succeeding with Your Personality, which is all about DISC. And I was very happy. Right. A recent CFE sent me a note and said it was the best course that he had in the CFE program. And I believe the IFA is going to do a little bit more of that as a result, more of that kind of training, which I think is so important in franchising.
Very, very powerful.
Yeah. So you've been a franchisor and a franchisee. Would you rather have been just a franchisor or just a franchisee, or are you happy with a little bit of both, a lot of franchisor?
Well, I started, there's no way I could have been a franchisor in the early day, when I was at 19, because I just didn't know enough. Yeah. A number of years later, after I left university and started an internet business, now this was in the year, we sometimes say the year 2 BG, because it was 2 years before Google was founded. Yeah. When we founded WSI. But it became obvious to me very quickly that the internet was not going to be, a local phenomenon. It was going to be global. And so when I thought about how do you scale a business, it was very natural to think of franchising because I had that experience in my early years. So I think being a franchisee was a really important prerequisite for me, at least, to being a franchisor. And I think probably in my early years, I thought about being a franchisor as kind of the next level above being a franchisee. And it was kind of like the next, you graduate to becoming a franchisor. What I've learned since that time, I've seen franchisees IPO their businesses before franchisors. I've seen private equity coming in and buying franchisees instead of the franchisor. Yeah. I've seen the wealth creation impact of a franchisee's business in many times eclipsing that of a franchisor. I've seen people selling and exiting their franchisor businesses, selling their business to private equity and buying into franchisee opportunities so it's really interesting, especially in today's world where private equity is getting so involved at the franchisee level, billion-dollar transactions of franchisee businesses, obviously not one franchise, it's hundreds of franchises. Yeah. But so I think it's not at all, that one they're very different. But I think I wonder sometimes if today, knowing everything I know, if I come into franchising as a franchisee again, I can certainly tell you that my son became a franchisee because I recommended that he became a College Pro franchisee before we acquired the company. If I had to buy a business for my daughter today, I'd buy a franchise for her. And so, it's such a powerful wealth creation tool as a franchisee.
So I want to get to private equity. But before I do that, you said something really interesting. I'm surrounded by 18 to 22, 23-year-olds. That's where my life is at the university. A couple of years ago, a 19-year-old, and when you had said, well, I wasn't at 19, I couldn't become a franchisor. Didn't know enough, didn't know anything. Well, this young man started in high school a marketing business. And when he told me the first day of class that he was making $10,000 a month in his own marketing business, I thought, I don't know, that's a stretch. $10,000 a month, 19 years old, and doing outsourced marketing services for businesses. But I took him at his word. Later on, found out it was true. And I introduced him. At the Titus Center, I have an advisory board. I have about 70 professionals who meet twice a year as part of our advisory board. And one of the reasons why they come is they want to meet my students, and they want to hear from my students. Why are they in franchising, and where are they looking to go in franchising? And so this was one of the students I put before my advisory board, and he told his story and what he was doing in marketing, but that he saw franchising as a way to leverage his expertise. Well, Ray Titus, founder of United Franchise Group and the fellow who endowed the Titus Center for Franchising, he was in the audience. He always is. And he heard this student at the break, went up and got him and said, I want you to come over and meet with me. Well, Ray owns 8, 9, 10 different franchise brands. He brought Michael in, my student, and Michael explained his story. And Ray said, I want to hire you for 3 to 6 months to come in and prove to me that what you do as a marketer would help my businesses. And if it works, we're going to talk about the next step for you. And at 19, Michael became a franchisor in partnership with Ray Titus. That business today is called Prevere. It's small business consulting. It's since been sold. Michael got a little chunk of money out of that. He had ownership of the business along with Ray. Michael lives abroad. He doesn't even live in the United States for the last couple of years, not directly in franchising, but still doing his marketing business. So it's amazing, the abilities of young people today that franchisors often overlook and don't understand. So I've graduated 30 students. 4 of them own 5 franchise brands today, and I've got 2 more in the FDD stage, the due diligence stage. So I'll soon probably have 6 of my 30 graduates who are franchisees and 1 who became a franchisor. And franchisors say, wait a minute, they're 20, they're 21. What do they know? Well, if they have a concentration in franchising, they know more about franchising than most first-year franchisees, for sure. They know more about franchising than even the best educated employees in franchising in many cases. So they know quite a bit, but do they have any money? Some do, some don't. Some can leverage it from family. But I'm wondering, you got in at 19. Why aren't more 19-year-olds getting into franchising? Are we encouraging it enough as a community in franchising?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And one of the other best kept secrets, I think, in franchising is one of our brands, College Pro, which has now been around for 51 years. We just celebrated our 50th summer last year. And we have graduated over 20,000 entrepreneurs through that program. And now, it started long before I was even a student, but through that program, the number of franchisor founders of franchise companies, people that were at one point a College Pro painter or a College Pro window cleaner that have gone on to start their own franchise system. Charlie Chase, the current chair of the IFA, was a College Pro painter. And, Elon Musk painted houses for College Pro with his brother Kimball, who was a College Pro franchisee. So the level of entrepreneurship that has come from that, it's not about painting, it's not about window cleaning, it's about teaching entrepreneurship to young people. And as you know, one of the real trends in education today is about creating practicums where students can actually do the thing, not just read the book or listen to the class, but they can actually do the thing. And that's really what College Pro is about. It's about allowing them to run a business. Now, it's just for the summer, but they run that business. And we have to train a kid up in like 2 months with all the entrepreneurial skills necessary to run a business that he's only going to run or she's only going to run for like 4 months and then close it down. And it needs to be profitable. So it's a super cool youth entrepreneurship accelerator. And, but to your point, and from there, they can go on and become a franchisee in another system or found their own company. But I do think that a lot of young people today have this mindset about, I got to do a startup. And the reality is one of the smartest things they could do is somehow figure out a way to become a franchisee. And as you know, under the foundation, which I'm now the chair of, the IFA Foundation, we had a program called Next Gen, which is about helping young people found franchise companies or become engaged in franchising. And it became highly successful. There's people that have started franchise systems, founded franchise systems, and exited with quite significant exits, or are building, 7-8 figure portfolios now coming through that program. So to your point, why not get started? Why waste any years on other things? Like, get started as a franchisee as early as you can would be my philosophy.
No, great. We actually have one of our advisory board members is Thomas Scott at Home Run Franchising. And we just announced this week that he has a special program aimed directly at graduates of the Titus Center. He will essentially get them into business for under $20,000 in one of his brands, because he's all about getting 19, 20, 21-year-olds, the Gen Z and millennials, into franchising. And I see that as an area where not enough franchisors are putting their emphasis, but that may be what's coming next.
Well, I'll tell you that at WSI and at Tutor Doctor, we have for a number of years had what we call a YES program, a Young Entrepreneur Scholarship Program, where we'll actually waive the franchise fee to somebody that qualifies. They're young, they don't have the capital, but we identify them as high potential and teachable. And we've had a good number of 7-figure franchisees come out of that started without a franchise and under our YES program. So I think he's really on the right track. If we can, especially in a business that's not capital intensive, if we can somehow find a way to get those franchisees involved without letting the franchise fee become a big barrier.
Yeah. We need to get you more involved in Titus Center, because WSI, perfect kind of franchise for our students, and Tutor Doctor as well. Tutor Doctor London, mother and son, came and spoke to my international tour. I took students before the pandemic, we went to Germany and we went to England, and we had a great time in both nations, but particularly we have a relationship with University of Roehampton outside of London, and your franchisee from Tutor Doctor came over and spoke to my group. So those are the kinds of franchises that make sense. So let me jump, we don't have much time left, into private equity. You got into franchising as well. You saw this opportunity to jump on board and as a private equity, as an accelerator in franchising. Why is private equity so crazy about franchising? How did that happen? How did you get into it?
Great question. I mean, there's a lot of technical reasons, from a financial engineering perspective and in the frameworks that private equity views the world through that really make franchising particularly appealing. One of the things, of course, is that you've got a recurring revenue stream, right? So that royalty creates predictability of cash flows. And that's something that private equity, especially in the lower interest rate environment that we've been living in, up until recently, there was just huge ways to put leverage on that. And another reason is this concept of operational leverage. So, most businesses, they'll have you could have a high gross margin, but franchising actually has a higher gross margin than Google in some ways. Because when you bring in an extra dollar of incremental revenue as a franchisor, that drops almost entirely to the bottom line. So when an extra dollar of royalty comes in, because you've got those fixed costs, so you're almost working with a gross margin of like close to 100%. And that is highly attractive to private equity. They come in and they look at it and say, okay, what can we do to scale this business, to ramp it up? And there's all kinds of things that can be accretive in terms of what they do to the marketing department, what they do with other acquisitions that they roll in. I mean, for example, Tutor Doctor acquired recently, I guess it's now been a couple of years, but acquired CodeWiz, which is a coding and robotics program for students. So it was what you see in the private equity world is they're rolling together similar businesses to multiply the cash flows. And there's also this huge opportunity for cross-pollination. So a kid that goes to CodeWiz for a coding or robotics program probably needs a tutor, and tutor doctors, students need summer programs. They need, March break programs. So there's a lot of cross-pollination. So we're seeing that in industries like children's programs, in fitness, in health. We're looking at how can we leverage at home services, obviously, how can we leverage these customer lists across multiple brands? So the one other reason is, this strategy that private equity often uses of roll-ups. So they'll go buy a whole bunch of similar kinds of companies. But there's always complications in how you roll those businesses together. The perfect scenario for a roll-up is franchising, because all the businesses are very similar. They're all using the same brand, the same systems. So one of the things private equity does when they buy into a franchise system is they start buying up the franchisees wherever they can and rolling that into the franchisor's earnings and cash flow, because it's a very low friction way to build scale in a system. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of reasons private equity loves franchising. Yeah. And the valuations of franchisors exceed what you see in many other industries.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Dan, you're going to be a keynoter at the Selling Franchises Bootcamp at Palm Beach Atlantic University, home of the Titus Center. You're going to be talking about driving franchise growth in this age of disruption, understanding the changing landscape of franchise development and today's strategies of success. I don't want you to give your speech, don't want you to give too much away. What are they going to take away from that? People who attend, these are franchise development people from all across the country.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the three legs of the stool of franchise development. So we're going to talk about, we've got to have lead generation. We've got to have a solid sales process or franchise development process. And then we've got to have a solid franchise development team. And then we tie all that together often with technology and how we leverage those three legs of the stool. So we're going to talk about a lot of the trends that are happening in lead generation. We're going to talk about some of the fundamentals that are required in a solid franchise development process. And then we're going to talk about how do you build a high performance team? What are the characteristics or capabilities of effective franchise development people? And, sometimes, you look at somebody from franchise development and they've got 20 years of experience selling franchises. And the truth, so you think you've got a real, star, but the truth is it might be just 2 years repeated 10 times. Like they're not as leading edge as their resume might imply. Yeah. And so what we're going to talk about is, some of those characteristics that separate the real A players from those that, you might not want to hire if you're a franchisor building your system. And we'll also talk about some of the broader trends that are happening in franchise development, whether that's what's going on in the broker world, what's going on in the franchise outsource world or the FSOs, and how that ecosystem is changing and evolving. So lots of interesting, good stuff we'll be talking about.
Well, I can't wait for that to happen. It's coming up soon. And Dan, you're going to be a big part of that. And be prepared, because I'm going to talk to you some more about being involved in and more visible with my students at Titus Center. Students do attend, but mostly it's franchise professionals who want to sell more franchises who come to the boot camp. But my students come for parts of it, or some of them will sit through all 2 days because they're so committed already to graduating and getting involved in franchising. And I think you've got brands that College Pro being one of them as well, that makes sense for my students. So I want to tie that in the future. And thank you for your time.
I'd love to help however I can. Certainly something I'm passionate about.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll talk to you real soon. Take care.
You got it. Thanks, John.
Thanks for tuning in to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast with Dr. John P. Hayes. Tune in next time for more conversation around all things franchising.